Yeah, 90 episodes. I'm just as shocked as you are. But what's cool is you know so much about writing ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs at this point. And hopefully with the aid of flashcards and notebooks, you've been studying and really getting this, and you can actually write out sentences. All right, let's jump in because we have a heavy subject this week. So we'll blast through the homework real quick. And there's going to be modified homework for next week. So hey, keep that in mind. All right. So looking at last week's sentence, again, like always, we're going to break that up into words that we recognize and determinatives, knowing they're at the end, helps us break them up. So that first word is our familiar U, the I and W, which is our stop sign that tells us we're going into the past. All right, so past tense, which doesn't always have the N. We didn't have the N in this case. It's an exception. All right, next we have our verb, radi, which means to give, or in this case, because we've had our past stop sign, gave. Then our pronoun, in this case, I, which is pronounced I. So I gave. And again, there's no N this time. Sometimes there isn't. That's why I threw this out there. There's exceptions, just like I before E and E before I and all that, except neighbor and way. All right, now we have onk with three slash marks, so it's lives, not life. Now we do have an N, and remember, N by itself either means for or of, like in the phrase for the ka of. So we'll figure out the whole sentence and which one to use. Now we have our noun, the ruler, haka, or a ruler, because there's no articles in ancient Egyptian. It can be the or a, or just ruler by itself. You don't even need an article sometimes. Again, we'll look at how the whole sentence works. Now we have a place, because we have a determinative for a place, which if you pronounce this out, it is New York. N-W-Y-R-K, New York. So the whole sentence is, I gave lives for the ruler of New York. Now the word of is not there right before New York, but you'll add that. Again, they don't always have these transitional words. Sometimes you have to fill them in, because again, Egyptian isn't exactly English. All right, beauty. We did this one last week, right? The glyph nefer, which means beauty, which can be written out with multiple signs or one three-consonant sign. And we talked about last week how if you have three of them in a row, it usually elevates it to the most beautiful or the most perfect or the most wonderful. Beauty has a few different meanings, or nefer rather does. So let's look at a similar example. If you have netter, the three-consonant sign for God, well, if you have three netters in a row, well, logically, what do you think this means? I'll let you guess at this one. Yep, it means gods, or all of the gods. Because remember, in ancient Egypt, they had gods for everything. It wasn't a monotheistic society, so you will see this all the time, like praying to the gods or giving favor to the gods. Curiously, it also works this way in numbers sometimes. So you remember a slash is 1, an upside down horseshoe, or a right side up horseshoe is 10, and the lotus leaf is 1,000. If you have three in a row, it can mean 3,000, but it can also be translated as thousands. So again, context. All right, we're going to talk about something heavy now. So we're going back to verb tenses. I'm going to introduce you to a verb tense that is very unique in ancient Egyptian. We've talked about the present tense, verbs that just mean something happened is happening now. And we've talked about the infinitive, how we add a T to the weak and extra weak version of the present tense, and that becomes the ing version of a verb. So loving, giving versus he gives, or he loves, or he saw, or he hears. Then we talked about the specific present, which adds the face, the HM, to the beginning with a stroke mark, and this makes it is. So is strong, is hearing, is seeing, is loving. And we talked about the past form, which, as the first sentence in our homework, the IW tells us it's our signpost. Usually we have an N afterwards, which is like the ED, but not always. But if you have the IW, that's how you know you're in the past. This past form, I remind you, is called sejenif, which would mean he heard. But that's also the name of the form of the verb in Egyptian. So when they talk about past form, that's what they call it. Well, there's another form in Egyptian That's called the relative form, and this has a name too, simetin, which means what he heard. So let me explain how the relative form works, because it's a little different, and that's mostly because we're dealing with description of something like he hears, he sees, he loves, to characterization of someone. And that takes a little bit to wrap your head around, because we don't have that in English. That this tense doesn't exist. It's sort of like how when you hear people from Europe saying, I have been there since 2 weeks. That's not proper English, but it is right in French and German. So there are things that work in different languages that aren't in English. In this case, the relative form is someone did something, what they did, not who they are. So let's look at an example. Let's just go down to the verb level, because we're going to spend some time on this one. It's complicated. So here's the verb to do, IR, right, with the helper single consonant. So if we have the past tense with the N for ED and then the pronoun he, you have he did, right? He did this in the past. Well, if you add a T to that, and you can see that at the top there, so now it's IRT dot N equals F. I crossed off the second R to just show about the helper single consonant next to the double consonant. So when you have this T, there I have circled it in black, this is what's going to change the past tense, and actually the present tense as well, because the relative form exists in both past and present form. And it now becomes, instead of he did, what he did. Now the T is not literally the word what, but when you have a T under the N there, or if there was no N, it would just be what he does, then it changes to the relative form. This also works for descriptions. So nefer, we talked about being good or perfect, beautiful. So if you were going to add a T at the end, so it's now nefer t with a T at the end, it changes from good or perfect to what is good. You're describing it. Or what is perfect, instead of just something is perfect. All right, let's look at another example. Here's a new verb for you. Chis, to favor, which is H and then HS and then an S, which is interesting because you now have helper letters on the front and back of this word. You have H followed by HS followed by S. So you only have to pronounce chis. You can cross off the H and the last S, or, well, really just write with the HS glyph if you had less room. Again, elasticity of the language. So chis, whether you pronounce the other S or not, means to favor. And this one comes up a lot because you're constantly favoring and praising different gods and different family members and different rulers. So if you were to add that T to the end there, and now it's chist, now you're saying what is favored or what to favor. So relative form, again, it's a lot to think about. So we're going to go slow on this one because you need to spend some time really thinking about it, because it doesn't exist in English. So it can be a little complicated. Well, it's not complicated, but just a little odd, only because we're not familiar with saying things like this in English, but it's very, very common, and it's going to lead to something called the participle. Excuse me. So we'll get to that soon as well. So for homework for this week, instead of doing a sentence, just practice your glyphing. Try writing out see if you can get to 150. You should know 150 glyphs. So see if you can do that. That's your homework. All right. And again, as always, if you like this video, subscribe to the channel, give it a bell ring, all that stuff, because it tells YouTube to share it with more people, and it helps spread the knowledge. And that's what we love doing here, sharing knowledge. Thanks for watching. Practice your glyphing 150 glyphs. Let's see if you can do it. See you next week.